The walls were thin, but her smile whispered secrets I wasn't supposed to hear. The day I moved into the apartment, the building already felt like it had a personality of its own, a quiet, watchful one. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the hallways, mingling with the earthy warmth of old wood and a hint of fresh laundry. Each creaking floorboard seemed to carry memories, subtle whispers of the lives that had passed through before me. I hadn't expected the landlady to be there the moment I arrived, yet there she was, standing by the door with an air of effortless grace. She was in her early 40s, poised yet approachable, the kind of woman who moved through a room as if she owned every quiet corner of it without needing to. Her smile was soft, but it carried weight, a blend of knowing humor and quiet vulnerability that immediately made the space feel warmer. "Welcome," she said, her voice low, slightly husky, and intimate in a way that made me lean in a fraction closer than necessary. "Stay quiet, these walls are thin." The words were casual, but the way her eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief made me wonder if she meant more than the obvious. There was a playful edge to her, a subtle invitation hidden beneath the surface of propriety. We shook hands, and I noticed the contrast immediately. Her grip was firm, yet gentle, confident but careful. It felt grounding, oddly comforting, and for a fleeting moment, I was acutely aware of the age difference, not as a barrier, but as a quiet intrigue, a dynamic that promised depth and unspoken stories. As she showed me around, I noticed the small details that defined her presence, the gentle way she adjusted a picture frame, the soft crease at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the faint scent of vanilla on her wrist. Each gesture was deliberate yet unpretentious, a reflection of a life carefully lived but still open to new experiences. Even in these brief moments, I felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, an interest that wasn't just physical, but emotional. She had a way of observing me without making me self-conscious, as if she could see through the walls of my carefully constructed exterior, into the quieter spaces where hesitation and curiosity mingled. By the time I set my last box down, I realized that moving in was no longer about a new apartment, it was about her. And though I didn't know her yet, the tiniest brush of her hand, the soft warmth in her eyes, and that enigmatic smile had already started to pull me in, quietly, irresistibly, like a story that had only just begun. The first few days in the apartment were quieter than I expected. Each morning, sunlight spilled through the tall, narrow windows, dust particles drifting lazily in the golden beams. I unpacked slowly, almost ritualistically, arranging my things as if giving myself permission to belong in this new space. But more than the boxes and furniture, I found myself noticing her. She was everywhere, though not intrusively so. The landlady moved through the building with a kind of quiet authority that made it seem effortless. She had this way of gliding down the hallway, her steps soft on the creaking wood, yet somehow precise, measured. I'd catch glimpses of her, sometimes adjusting a curtain, sometimes leaning slightly over a railing, her hands brushing against the polished wood, the faint scent of vanilla trailing behind her. In those moments, I felt like an observer in a delicate, private dance. When our paths crossed, even briefly, I felt an electric awareness. The first time she handed me the mailbox key, our hands brushed, lightly, almost accidentally, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have. She looked at me with a knowing smile, subtle yet teasing, as if she had caught me off guard and was quietly enjoying the moment. I forced a casual smile in return, my chest tightening in a way that told me I was already far too aware of her presence. The building itself seemed to amplify her charm. The faint clink of her teacup from the lounge, the soft humming of a tune she might have been whistling, the occasional distant laughter of tenants, it all became a backdrop to her figure moving effortlessly through it. I began noticing small details, the way her hair caught the light in the late afternoon, the gentle curve of her shoulders, and the tiny crease that formed at the corner of her eyes whenever she smiled. These details weren't just visual, they felt almost tactile, as if I could feel the rhythm of her life brushing against mine. There was a subtle rhythm to our interactions, her eyes meeting mine just long enough to make me aware, our words carefully measured, polite, yet layered with something unspoken. In the quiet moments, I caught myself wondering what thoughts lingered behind those hazel eyes, what stories hid in the gentle tilt of her head. By the end of the week, the apartment was no longer just a new home, it was a stage, and she was a quietly captivating presence I couldn't stop noticing. The more ordinary my days became, the more extraordinary she seemed, an unspoken tension weaving itself into the corners of the hallways, in the gentle gestures and fleeting glances that seemed to say more than words ever could. It was a quiet evening when it happened, an ordinary moment that suddenly felt charged with a tension I hadn't expected. I was carrying a stack of books to my apartment when one of them slipped from my grasp. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and I bent down quickly to pick it up, cursing under my breath. Before I could straighten up, she appeared beside me, as if drawn by the sound or maybe by intuition. "Need a hand?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. Her hands hovered near mine as I reached for the book, and when our fingers brushed, it was an almost electric, fleeting touch, but long enough for me to notice the warmth of her skin, the firmness of her fingers, and the surprising steadiness in her touch. I felt my pulse quicken, a strange mixture of embarrassment and something else I wasn't ready to name. She smiled gently, her eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "Careful with those. They're heavier than they look." There was no condescension in her tone, only an attentive care that made the moment feel intimate, even though it was entirely innocent. As we lifted the book together, our movements synchronized almost by accident. I was acutely aware of how close we were, our knees nearly brushing, the subtle heat of proximity, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the soft lavender that lingered in the hallway. I caught myself wondering how someone could move through a space so naturally, so comfortably, and yet make it feel like the air itself had shifted around her. When the book was finally settled on the table inside my apartment, she lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Our eyes met, and there was a pause, just long enough for unspoken curiosity to hang between us. A shared laugh slipped out, light and unforced, as if acknowledging the absurdity of how a simple task had become something charged with quiet significance. I noticed how her presence made the room feel warmer, even though the sun had long dipped below the horizon. The soft creak of the floor beneath her feet, the gentle rustle of her clothes as she moved, the subtle sparkle in her eyes, it all combined into a moment that felt suspended in time. By the time she finally excused herself, leaving me slightly flustered and oddly elated, I realized something had shifted. What had been polite acquaintance before now carried a subtle tension, a quiet awareness that we had touched, not just with our hands, but in a way that felt deeper, a slow, unspoken recognition that something delicate and profound was beginning to grow between us. It was late afternoon when I found her alone in the lounge, sitting by the window with a cup of steaming tea cradled in her hands. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow across her face, highlighting the subtle lines that spoke of experience, resilience, and quiet grace. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure if I should intrude, but her soft smile, almost imperceptible, invited me in. "Tea," she offered, gesturing toward the cup on the small side table. Her voice was gentle, calm, and carried a warmth that made it easy to sink into conversation without pretense. I nodded, taking the offered seat across from her. At first, our talk was casual, about the building, the neighborhood, and the peculiar quirks of the apartment. Yet, as the minutes stretched into a quiet rhythm, the words began to deepen, peeling back layers we rarely show to strangers. She spoke of her life here, of small regrets, of quiet joys found in simple routines. I shared fragments of my own story, hesitant at first, but gradually feeling the strange ease of trust. The intimacy of the room, the soft hum of distant traffic, and the faint scent of her perfume blended with the aroma of tea, making the space feel suspended, almost timeless. I noticed the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup when she spoke of difficult memories, the slight tilt of her head when she was thoughtful, and the gentle curve of her lips when she allowed herself a private smile. Every detail felt magnified, every subtle gesture a language of its own. There was a moment when our hands nearly touched on the small table. Neither of us moved away, letting the proximity linger. The warmth of her hand so close to mine was a silent invitation, a quiet acknowledgement of a connection that was growing beyond simple acquaintance. Our eyes met more often than necessary, holding just long enough for unspoken understanding and curiosity to flow between us. For the first time, I felt that peculiar mix of comfort and tension that only comes when someone sees parts of you that no one else does, your hesitations, your private fears, your quiet longing. In her presence, I was aware of her attentiveness, the subtle ways she noticed everything without judgment. By the time I left, I carried with me a sense of something deeper than mere attraction. It was a connection rooted in vulnerability, respect, and a slowly blossoming curiosity about each other's lives. That evening, the apartment felt warmer, the building less like a collection of rooms and more like a shared secret, held between us in the silent spaces of conversation, laughter, and lingering glances. It was a late evening when our accidental encounter happened. I had stepped out onto the balcony to escape the hum of the apartment, craving the stillness of the city at night. The lights twinkled below, distant yet intimate, and the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there she was, already leaning against the railing, gazing at the horizon with a contemplative expression. "Beautiful night," I said, not knowing what else to say. She turned slightly, acknowledging me with a small smile, the kind that made your chest tighten without a word being spoken. She didn't invite me to sit, and I didn't ask. Somehow, the quiet space between us felt enough. We stood side by side, our shoulders brushing occasionally. The proximity was accidental, yet electric. I was acutely aware of her presence, the soft sway of her hair in the breeze, the subtle warmth radiating from her body, the way her perfume mingled with the night air in a delicate, almost intoxicating harmony. My own movements felt slower, careful, as if the space itself was fragile and required mindfulness. At some point, a chill passed through the balcony, and instinctively, I offered her my jacket. She hesitated for a heartbeat before accepting, the fabric brushing lightly against her arm as I draped it over her shoulders. That simple touch, the warmth of our hands meeting briefly as I adjusted it, spoke louder than any conversation ever could. There was a pause, a long, weighty silence, where neither of us needed words. The air between us was heavy with unspoken curiosity, awareness, and an emerging desire neither dared to name aloud. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes holding mine just a moment too long, and I felt it, a quiet recognition, a mutual understanding that something was shifting, subtly, irrevocably. We were two people, connected by more than circumstance, yet careful not to cross a line that hadn't yet been defined. For those few minutes, time seemed to stretch. The city lights became a blurred backdrop, the hum of distant traffic a lullaby, and the cool night air a witness to our unspoken confessions. We moved with careful synchrony, aware of each other, drawn to each other, yet restrained, savoring the tension that built in silence. When she finally stepped back, retreating toward the apartment doors, I felt a strange mixture of longing and satisfaction. Nothing had been said, yet everything had been conveyed, the brush of hands, the shared warmth, the lingering glance. That night, I realized that romance didn't always need words. Sometimes, it was found in the quiet spaces between two people who understood each other too well to need explanation. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the city seemed to exhale and the hum of daily life faded into a distant murmur. I had invited her to the small balcony just off the lounge, ostensibly to share the view and a cup of tea. But the words I had rehearsed for days, the ones I had kept tucked away, hesitant and fragile, finally found themselves ready to escape. She leaned casually against the railing, her fingers wrapped around the teacup, the faint warmth radiating into my own hands when I passed her the second cup. Her gaze was soft, observant, and for a moment, I felt the weight of her attention pressing gently, almost painfully, against my chest. I had never been more aware of her, the slight curve of her shoulders in the lamplight, the way her hair caught the breeze, the subtle glimmer in her eyes that suggested she, too, felt the pull between us. I took a deep breath, words faltering, heart racing. I've been meaning to tell you something, I said, voice barely above the whisper of wind. She turned toward me, curious but patient, giving me the space to continue. I admire you, I said finally, the confession feeling simultaneously monumental and fragile. More than I expected. I don't just mean, as a landlady. You've made this place feel different. Like it's alive. Like you're alive, and I can't stop noticing it. She remained quiet, letting my words hang in the air between us, her eyes thoughtful. There was no judgment, only presence, a steady calm that made the flutter in my chest seem safe rather than chaotic. I could feel the hesitation vibrating in both of us, the delicate balance of desire and propriety, the age difference, the careful boundaries we had maintained, now tinged with new possibilities. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "I was wondering when you'd say something like that," she admitted, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I've noticed you noticing me, more than I probably should have." She laughed lightly, a sound warm and melodic, easing the tension that had coiled between us. There was a pause. Our eyes met, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the distance between us, years, experiences, and unspoken rules, felt irrelevant. My hand brushed against hers, almost accidental, but deliberate enough to linger. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers rest lightly on mine, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding, mutual desire, and the cautious hope that perhaps this connection was meant to grow. By the time the night deepened and the city lights shimmered below, we had confessed something beyond words, something tender, hesitant, and profoundly human. The slow burn of our feelings had reached its emotional peak, and though nothing had changed drastically yet, everything had shifted. The pull between us was undeniable, tempered by respect, care, and the quiet thrill of possibility. The days that followed were unhurried, a gentle unfolding of familiarity and closeness. Nothing had been rushed, no dramatic confessions beyond what we had already shared, but the atmosphere between us had shifted. The apartment, once a simple collection of walls and furniture, had become a shared sanctuary, a space where warmth and subtle affection could flourish without fanfare. Morning sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, painting everything in a soft, golden glow. I found her in the kitchen one day, sipping tea, the steam curling around her face. She glanced up at me, her smile quiet but knowing, and something inside me loosened, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I joined her, and our hands met over the rim of a shared mug. There was no sudden declaration, only the lingering warmth of touch, the kind that speaks of trust and comfort. We spent evenings on the balcony, side by side, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in comfortable silence. Her head would occasionally rest lightly on my shoulder as we watched the city lights flicker below. The closeness felt natural, unforced, and it deepened with every small gesture, fingers brushing while passing a cup, knees touching subtly as we sat on the couch, laughter shared over trivial stories. Each movement was gentle, deliberate, and full of meaning. Our connection was quiet but profound. There were lingering glances that spoke of shared understanding, gentle touches that conveyed warmth and affection, and conversations that dug just deep enough to reveal vulnerabilities without breaking the delicate balance of respect. I realized that what had drawn me to her, the subtle grace, the confidence, the quiet depth, was now interwoven with the daily rhythm of our lives. One evening, as the wind carried the faint scent of jasmine through the balcony doors, she reached out and entwined her fingers with mine. There was no hesitation, only an ease that came from months of subtle, careful growth. I felt her thumb brush against my hand, a soft, grounding gesture, and in that moment, I understood the quiet power of a love that didn't need to be dramatic to be undeniable. By the time the night deepened and the city's hum faded into a distant lullaby, our story had found its proper rhythm. The slow-burn romance, nurtured through patience, observation, and unspoken understanding, had reached a warm, fulfilling resolution. She leaned her head on my shoulder, I rested mine lightly against hers, and for the first time, I felt the serene joy of knowing that this connection, delicate, respectful, and deeply human, was ours to cherish. The apartment walls may have been thin, but the life we had built between them was rich, full, and entirely our own. Sparkles, if you enjoyed this slow-burn story of quiet longing and unexpected connection, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale of love and mystery. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that words couldn't capture?